Maria Leone, and I've been teaching Pilates for 30 years, training teachers for almost 25 years, and new to my career is working as a Pilates expert witness. What is that, Maria? Well, as our industry begins to grow, and as there are many, many different types of reformers and other pieces of equipment and many equipment manufacturers, there are accidents beginning to happen in and around Pilates studios. So this is a little bit of information that I've gotten from my time working as an expert witness about how you can keep your clients safe and how you can avoid lawsuits. So the first thing that I want to talk about with you is your education. And did you really get a good, solid education from a major company with many hours of education? That's first and foremost. Because I was an expert witness on a case where a teacher was certified and taught a very contraindicated exercise for a client who had osteoporosis, and the result was a fracture to that client's spine. Now that is something that I teach in our teacher training program here in one of the very first modules, what to do and what not to do if you have a client that has osteoporosis. So your education should have involved some information about what you can do with clients with injuries to keep them safe. So that's the first thing. The second thing, there seems to be a lot of people interested in coming to Pilates workshops, but not as many that really complete a course and go all the way through and have their credential. So one of the very first things that I'm looking at as an expert witness is who was the person teaching, were they properly trained, and do they have their credential? So I also worked on a case where it was actually a very experienced teacher, but she didn't have a teaching credential. I couldn't understand. So you know, not that that made or broke the case, but I was just like, why if she's been teaching that long, why didn't she just go out and get a credential? Many of us, myself included, when I first started working, there was no such thing as a teaching credential. But as the industry changed and as education became available and certification programs and exams and tests and certificates and credentials, I went ahead and I made sure that I had them, and you should have that as well. You should always have an intake form for all of your clients and have them sign a waiver. And they should get a copy of the waiver. And check out the rules about that in state to state, because that also was an important role in one of the cases that I worked on, that the client had signed a waiver but had never really received a copy of the waiver. Also, the previous case that I talked to you about where the client had osteoporosis, the client had actually written it down on their intake form that she had osteoporosis. I don't know if the trainer saw it or didn't see it, but make sure you go back to those intake forms and read and make sure you have a client that doesn't have something that you really need to know about. Of course, there are times that clients don't tell us everything. I actually had a client that did get a fracture in her back as a result of doing Pilates. And she was a client who had osteoporosis, but somehow really didn't think that that was that important or didn't want me to know about it, which that was on her, not on me. So, liability insurance. Make sure you carry liability insurance, and I recommend you carry liability insurance if you are teaching off-site anywhere. If you are an employee and working under the umbrella as an employee at a studio, you're covered. But if you're working as an independent contractor anywhere, which is still the norm in many Pilates studios, make sure you have your own liability insurance, and it's not really that expensive for you to get. Let's talk about the practical stuff. So one danger in a Pilates studio is actually the springs breaking. And I know that you probably don't think that can happen, and it has happened very rarely. I think I've only seen myself in our studio 2 times in 30 years a spring break. But the springs can break, especially if your springs are not well maintained. And if your clients are constantly changing springs and having them sort of slingshot. So anytime you take a spring off a machine, and you want your teachers to do this, you want your clients to do it, the spring comes off and then that's it. That's what you should hear. What we don't want then is just lifting up the spring and releasing it, where there's like this snapping action back, and that snapping action on the spring is what causes the spring to become weak. So when you look at your springs, all of the coils should be very tightly closed. If you see a spring that there is a gap in the coil, you now know that there is a weakness right there at that spot in the spring, and it needs to be changed. So wherever you're at, make sure that the equipment is being maintained. And in some cities, there are companies that provide this service, that's all they do is service Pilates equipment. That's what we do here in Los Angeles. Someone comes and services all of our equipment, but on top of that, we're sort of regularly looking at springs. We have springs here in the closet, and we change springs out all the time as soon as we see that there is a problem. The other accidents that come into play in a Pilates studio, I feel, are mostly about clients falling and about teachers not using their good common sense when setting up the equipment. It is not the equipment that is dangerous. It is how the equipment is being used, which is often dangerous. And I always teach teachers that the very first rule of teaching is knowing your equipment, understanding your equipment, and as you're going through your teaching, it's like you're partnering your clients, right? You're getting them up and down off the machine safely. You're aware of any unstable parts, any twists in the rope, any kinks, anything that, like you're constantly looking for that. And I really don't feel like that is addressed enough in teacher training. It's something that I always address. We spend a whole lot of time talking about if somebody's has their shoulders up too much, or are their knees hyperextending, or their elbows are hyperextending. None of these things can cause the kind of injury or harm that, let's say, getting on and off the machine the wrong way could create. That could create a real injury. So some little specific things, and there's so many brands of equipment and so many manufacturers, you really have to understand that equipment, that piece of equipment that you're working on, okay? So I'm going to show you a couple things just about this reformer. Well, here's one thing about every reformer. Every single reformer in the world has this big moving carriage, which is basically just a skateboard in a track. And if there's no springs on the machine, which isn't that often, or if there's light springs on the machine, so I have the lightest spring, this is extremely unstable. So we have to be very aware when clients are getting on and off the machine that either this is very stable for them, or that they're getting on and they're getting off by stepping up and down onto the piece of the reformer that doesn't move. Now, the client looks down at the reformer. They don't have this, the knowledge of all the inner workings of the reformer, and they just see a surface that looks really big and a surface that looks really skinny, and their brain tells them to step to this side. So this position, standing up here on the reformer, is not a position I like to teach at all in my studio. For me, it's just too much risk. It's more risk for me than benefit, and that's another concept that I'm always thinking about, and I'm always teaching my teachers to be assessing. What is the risk? What is the benefit of what you're doing? So just getting up and down from the machine. Anytime your clients are on their knees, keep your eye on them, right? So whether they're facing forward, side, or back, lots of things happen. In particular, I'm going to change my spring. In particular, there's a very well-known exercise. You might know it as chest expansion. You might know it as tricep pull. But when the client is facing the back here, if they're not well stabilized and they are not ready for this sensation, and they jerk or pull, they pull rapidly on the rope, they very often will, let me see if I can really kind of do it. Yeah, there you go. They can topple. And each and every time I teach that exercise, I always say, stand tall, engage your glutes, move very slowly at first because it's very easy to lose your balance. And even with that big disclaimer, it is very often we still have a client that will topple. I want to show you just one other little thing about this particular reformer. There's more and more exercises being developed in the Pilates world, and some of them are good and great, but some of them the machine wasn't exactly designed for, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So there's all this great work standing on the side of the reformer where we use the ropes and the pulleys, and I love them all. Why? Because they take your clients upright, right? We need our clients to be upright in their Pilates practice. But if you have a stronger client that needs more tension and they take this carriage all the way out there, at some point, this carriage, see that? The carriage can actually begin to lift up and out of the reformer, and the whole carriage can flip out of the frame. Now that's not every single equipment manufacturer, but that's for a lot of equipment manufacturers. Other things to look at are making sure that the box that you work with sits completely on the carriage. So we have several different sizes of boxes in the studio. Some of them are longer, and some of them have like a longer lip on them, and so there's an overhang. Anytime there's an overhang here on over the edge of the carriage, that box can flip. Make sure you know how to put your jump board into your machine. The jump board needs support, so either you have a jump board that has steel in it, or you are using the foot bar in some way to support the jump board. I even worked on a case where a client was new to a studio. She wasn't exactly sure how the jump board was supposed to go into the machine. She dropped the jump board, it hit her foot, and she ended up with permanent nerve damage on her foot. So I don't mean to scare you, but I do want to scare you just a little bit. So here's the major takeaway. Make sure you get good education, get your credential, have your clients sign waivers, read the intake form, and always be checking your equipment and have really good knowledge of the particular equipment that you're working on, because we want our clients to be safe and healthy, and we want to be healthy and prosperous in our careers. Okay, I hope that was helpful.